For virtually all of the known history of Homo sapiens, humans were known to have enslaved other human members of other groups, and this is a near universal trait seen in virtually every culture throughout all continents without fail. And it's even possible that our stronger, smarter cousins, the Neanderthal, might have been enslaved by early humans, as it has been found that female Neanderthal lineages can be seen in modern humans, although male Neanderthal lineages cannot. Of course, most people already know that the vast majority of slaves sold from sub-Saharan Africa were not exported to the United States of America, with the bulk that crossed the Atlantic landing all over Latin America, so much that in the present day, the majority of the population of many Latino countries such as the Dominican Republic and Brazil have at least some African ancestry, and in fact, there are about the same number of self-identified blacks in Latin America as there are in the United States, as I discussed in a video some time ago. But in American curriculum, we are told many stories about the toiling work of slaves and a few daring stories of escape, but not really much else, and it would probably come as a surprise to many that although by and large the overwhelming majority of escaped black slaves in the southern US made their way north where they would gain sanctuary, with some even making it as far as Canada, out of blacks that had gained their own freedom by barter, favors, or simply getting lucky and being released in a slave owner's will, many remained in the South. Shockingly enough, in 1860, out of nearly 500,000 free blacks in the U.S., 45% lived in southern states, with 15% of free blacks in the region owning slaves themselves, although the bulk of this community were mulattoes of significant European heritage, many being nearly indistinguishable from other whites, yet because of the one-drop rule that instilled the strict racial dichotomy seen there, were considered colored in the United States Census. This rule is what largely helped these various communities of African or partial African descent to coalesce into a single ethnic population following the Emancipation Proclamation, falling under the umbrella category of black, which described not only the free people of color, Louisiana Creoles, a group which can largely fall under the former category, Gullah of the Carolinian coast, escaped slaves who had escaped north, and of course the roughly 3.5 million remaining blacks who had gained their freedom. The divisions between these groups are largely absent in the present day, with a couple exceptions, and most fall under mainstream American culture, but this is definitely not the case for other areas of the Americas, as of course Dominicans of mixed Spanish, Taino, and African descent would not consider themselves to be remotely similar to the Haitians lying on the western half of Hispaniola, although in Brazil racial identification is far more fluid, being much more of a spectrum than any other country on earth, as many self-identified whites are less European than pardos, and many pardos are less European than blacks. Brazil, being the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, also has quite an interesting history with their various African-descended populations. It is true that Brazil imported more African slaves than any other country in the Americas, with over 7 million crossing the Atlantic, and as a result, over 30% of the national gene pool is of African origin, as mentioned, with various groups having high variation, with even old stock colonial descended whites sitting at around 10%, and many slaves in Brazil had gained their freedom quite early on, such as during the Dutch-Portuguese War, wherein both the Portuguese and the Dutch employed a large number of African slaves, promising their freedom. Henrique Diaz was the leader of the Afro-Brazilian regiment in the Northeast and loyal to the Portuguese during the war and up until his death in the 1600s, having traveled to Portugal in order to personally convince the crown to free the remaining enslaved men that served in the war. But rather than being freed due to displaying their loyalty and willingness to die for the crown, another group of free blacks who managed to escape began to develop in the northeast of Brazil, known as the Quilombo or Macambo, who came from many different tribes and nations throughout Africa, with a substantial percentage being Muslims. The Quilombolas incited several slave rebellions in northeast Brazil in the 17th century, which resulted in a great ire being directed towards them by the Portuguese officials, and the chief Quilombola settlement was raided, and the entirety of the community was believed to be killed or enslaved by the Portuguese and later the Brazilians. Fascinatingly, it was not until nearly 3 centuries later in the 1970s that it was discovered that the Quilombolas were not entirely eradicated as once thought, as a small group had escaped to the sparsely populated interior of Alagoas and other states in the northeast, some having integrated with Amerindian villages, and others having established their own communities hidden in the jungles for generations, having a far more African-derived culture than other African-descended people of Brazil, and are treated much in the same regard as indigenous Brazilians in the present day. Another similar community in Latin America, where descendants of escaped slaves are for the most part known collectively as Maroons, were the Palenquero of northern Colombia, who similarly are the descendants of blacks who escaped slavery from cities on the Caribbean coast and fled further inland, creating the village of San Basilio de Palenque. And the Palenquero today speak a unique Creole form of Spanish, arguably the only form of Creole Spanish in the Americas, being heavily influenced by Amerindian and African languages. And outside of this, there were many cases of escaped black slaves integrating into Amerindian villages, just as there were in the United States to a lesser extent. So there were indeed Maroon communities in English-speaking British colonies. It was just with the United States having such a large white population and density compared to the West Indies, it was far more difficult for escaped slaves to actually form their own communities in secret, which was why the overwhelming majority, especially in the twilight years of the antebellum South, chose to trek north rather than stay put. The British West Indian colonies initially had white majorities, with the Irish being used en masse as indentured servants in Barbados and elsewhere, and in fact the majority of Afro-Caribbean populations from Anglo countries have at least some Irish ancestry in their heritage. But as the slave population increased higher and higher on the West Indian islands, more and more of the non-slave owning whites of these islands decided to leave in kind, mostly to the United States, largely homogenizing them. This also came with the consequence of large-scale uproar and dissatisfaction among the plantation working slave population, outnumbering their masters 200 to 1 in some areas, and hence a large number of slave rebellions were set off across the Caribbean. Unfortunately for most, there really was nowhere to run on some of the smaller islands, but on Jamaica, Maroon communities had existed since before the British even took control of the island, a relic of slaves who had escaped to the mountainous interior from the Spaniards. And during the British conquest of the island, many more slaves fled to the mountains. So, as you can tell, although European colonial powers were never overly fond of these independent Maroon communities, thinking they might incite further slave rebellions or escapes, most were perfectly content with taking advantage of them and defeating common enemies, proving to be a thorn in the side for the Spanish Empire especially, seen with the English officer and explorer Sir Francis Drake, famous for circumnavigating the globe and discovering the Drake Passage. Drake was a bane to the Spanish Empire, pirating Spanish ships and plundering settlements in the Caribbean for years, making him a national hero in his home country of England. And Drake even personally visited and treated with several Maroon leaders in Central America in order to unilaterally combat the Spanish before dying of dysentery in Panama in 1596. In Jamaica, a large proportion of the interior was populated by Maroons, threatening the ever-growing population of black slaves and plantations all throughout the island, and a large group of Maroons and recently escaped slaves rebelled against the colonial authority, eventually being defeated, with a large number deported from Jamaica either to the British colony of Sierra Leone or all the way to Canada, where they helped form the Black Nova Scotian community. And although they never made up a particularly high percentage of the province's population in its history, peaking around 3%, it is the oldest African-descended population in the northeast of the North American continent, and they were, up until the 1960s, virtually the only major black population in Canada. The Windward Maroons, who remained neutral during the war, still do exist, however, living quite simple lifestyles with a culture very reminiscent of the African nations they derive from. However, by and large, the most noteworthy Maroon community today are the Guianese Maroons in the territory of the Guianas, namely the former British and Dutch territories of Guyana and Suriname, and the current French territory of Guyana. Early in the history of the Guianas, the Dutch owned virtually all of this territory, although nearly all settlements were on the coast, with large plantations owned by Dutch and a few Portuguese planters, and when African slaves escaped, they trekked for miles deep into the Amazon rainforest, and although some attempted to return to Africa, for the most part, they accepted their fates and created secret villages loosely connected to one another, splintering into roughly 6 tribes over the centuries, with the Saramacan and Induca being the largest. Now, unlike other Maroon groups, the Maroons of the Guianas were never recaptured, conquered, or forced back into the general society, and the Dutch, realizing it wasn't exactly feasible or cost efficient to launch a full-scale sweep through tens of thousands of miles of jungles, decided to treat with the Maroons, eventually reincorporating them into what would later become Suriname and French Guiana. These were villages of near full-blooded Africans transplanted to the continents of the Americas, and their culture and societies were very similar to that of Africa, having a comparable climate and landscape in the Caribbean region as West Central Africa, and they even adopted a unique script known as Afaka for transcribing their languages, Creole languages with extremely strong African influence. Numbering in the hundreds of thousands in the Guianas today, around 20% in Suriname and 10% in French Guiana, Maroons have always considered themselves to be very ethnically and culturally distinct from others in the region, as unlike in the United States, there was no binary racial classification. Although due to recent missionary work, the majority of the community has adopted Christianity and is becoming increasingly integrated into these societies, rather than being the de facto autonomous nation that they had always been. There are many other fascinating tales of the Maroons such as this, and I hope you learned something new from today's video. Be sure to let me know your thoughts on the Maroons and other free blacks of the Americas, and for today's poll, tell me which group of Maroons captured your attention the most. And as always, this has been Mason. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.